There are connections that feel like they enter your life through the front door. And then there are connections that feel like they enter through the unconscious. The second kind drastically changes people, not always because the relationship itself is healthy, not always because it lasts, not always because the person is meant to stay, but because something about the connection ruptures the existing structure of the self. And when that happens, people often reach for spiritual language to explain the experience. Twin flame, divine counterpart, sacred union, karmic mirror, because ordinary language does not fully capture what the body and psyche are experiencing. People describe obsessive thoughts, telepathy, dreams, energy surges, unexplainable recognition, emotional collapse, heightened intuition, identity dissolution, sudden spiritual opening, or intense physical sensations moving through the body. And for many people, these experiences are real. But the interpretation of them is where things become complicated. Because what people call twin flame energy is often a collision between attachment trauma, unconscious projection, psychological mirroring, nervous system activation, and genuine spiritual awakening occurring simultaneously. That combination is extraordinarily intense, especially for sensitive people. And when the nervous system experiences that level of activation, the psyche often begins opening faster than the person is prepared for. That's where Kundalini experiences sometimes emerge. Not because the relationship itself is automatically divine, but because the connection destabilized the existing identity structure enough to force unconscious material upward. People misunderstand Kundalini constantly. They reduce it to bliss, ascension, light, or mystical experiences, which can happen. But genuine Kundalini processes are often deeply destabilizing, because Kundalini is not simply spiritual energy. It is consciousness moving through a nervous system that still contains unresolved conditioning. And when that energy rises too quickly, everything hidden begins surfacing at once. Trauma, grief, shame, fear, attachment wounds, identity fragmentation, suppressed emotion, stored survival. The person feels spiritually cracked open, and because the awakening coincided with a powerful relationship, the mind often concludes this person caused my spiritual awakening because they are my divine counterpart. But sometimes the relationship functioned more like a catalyst rather than a destination. That's an important distinction. There are people who enter your life and activate dormant material so deeply that the entire internal structure begins reorganizing. That does not automatically mean the relationship itself is spiritually aligned long term. It means the connection bypassed defenses. And when defenses collapse, consciousness expands rapidly. That expansion can feel supernatural, especially for people who previously lived primarily through logic, suppression, performance, control, or emotional compartmentalization. Suddenly, they began experiencing synchronicities, heightened intuition, energetic sensitivity, dream activity, body sensations, spiritual perception, or profound existential questioning. Their old identity begins dying, and ego death is terrifying. People romanticize awakening, but real spiritual awakening often begins as psychological collapse. Not because awakening is a punishment, because the false self cannot survive expanded awareness. The nervous system can no longer suppress what the soul already knows. And relationships are one of the fastest ways unconscious material surfaces, especially relationships involving intermittent reinforcement, intense mirroring, emotional inconsistency, idealization, abandonment activation, or deep psychological projection. Those dynamics create enormous emotional charge, and the body interprets that change as significance. Sometimes correctly, sometimes not. That's where discernment becomes essential, because not every spiritually activating relationship is healthy. Some connections trigger awakening through destabilization. Others support awakening through safety. Those are very different paths. One opens through rupture, the other opens through integration. And many people unconsciously confuse suffering with sacredness because pain changes consciousness. Longing changes consciousness. Obsession changes consciousness. Loss changes consciousness. Grief changes consciousness. But altered consciousness alone is not proof of divine union. Sometimes people are experiencing nervous system overload while interpreting it entirely through spiritual framework. And honestly, I think this is where parts of the spiritual community can become dangerous, because there's a tendency to romanticize emotional suffering instead of understanding it. People are encouraged to remain attached to dynamics that are psychologically harmful because they've been told if it's intense, it must be spiritual. It's not always true. Intensity and alignment are not the same thing. Some people trigger awakening because they activate the exact wounds the soul can no longer avoid. The relationship becomes the portal through which unconscious material enters awareness. That can absolutely feel spiritual because it is spiritual. But spiritual does not automatically mean meant to stay. It's one of the hardest lessons people learn during awakening. Sometimes the person who awakens you is not the person meant to walk beside you afterward. Sometimes they were the earthquake, not the home. And earthquakes change landscapes permanently, especially internally. I think one of the reasons perceived twin flame connections feel so overwhelming is because they often collapse the illusion of separation inside the psyche. People suddenly become aware of their wounds, their longing, their fragmentation, their unmet needs, their suppressed grief, their emotional hunger, their fear of abandonment, their fear of intimacy, their fear of dissolution. The relationship becomes a mirror so psychologically intense that the person cannot maintain their previous level of unconsciousness anymore. And once awareness expands, life changes permanently. The problem is that many people become fixated on the person instead of understanding the transformation. They spend years chasing reunion instead of asking, what was this connection trying to reveal inside me? That question changes the entire journey, because awakening is not ultimately about another person. It's about consciousness. It's about becoming aware of what has been unconsciously running your life. And relationships expose that faster than almost anything else, especially relationships carrying profound energetic charge. Now, that does not mean every twin flame experience is delusion. I want to be very clear about that. I absolutely believe certain people encounter connections that transcend ordinary relational experience. I think there are connections that operate beyond purely psychological frameworks. But I also think discernment matters deeply, because spirituality without discernment becomes projection very quickly. And projection is powerful when someone is emotionally starved, spiritually searching, or carrying unresolved trauma and attachment wounds. The soul can recognize something meaningful while the wounded parts simultaneously distort the interpretation. Both can exist together. That is why awakening requires grounding, not just transcendence, grounding, stabilization, discernment, nervous system regulation, self-awareness, psychological honesty. Otherwise, people can disappear into spiritual fantasy while abandoning reality entirely. And real awakening does not remove someone from reality. It brings them into deeper contact with truth, including uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the uncomfortable truth is the connection awakened you, but could not sustain you. And those are not the same thing. I think spiritual maturity eventually stops asking, how intense is this connection? And starts asking, what does this connection create inside my body, nervous system, consciousness, and life over time? Because real alignment does not require chronic emotional destruction to maintain itself. It may challenge you, transform you, expand you, but it should not continuously fracture your nervous system. And honestly, one of the deepest signs of spiritual maturity is when someone stops chasing activation and starts valuing coherence. Because awakening is not just about opening spiritually. It is about becoming whole enough that your spirit, body, emotions, and nervous system are no longer at war with each other. If this resonates, hit that like and subscribe button. I am Kat Grace. Until next time, Namaste.